And that leads us into our next speaker, Dr. Dickson Despommier. 10 years ago, he and a group of students started talking about how can we feed people? Where can we grow food that's convenient to where they want to eat it? And here we go with vertical farms. So welcome.
Thank you so much. It's been a long road to get here. I've made several efforts to get to your state of Alaska, but I haven't quite made it yet. It's on my bucket list, and trust me, I'll get there. Meanwhile, Robert Shields and I have been talking, and I appreciate the fact that he thought enough of my idea to include it into this resilient planet discussion. So I'm going to share my screen with everybody. And start my PowerPoint presentation by clicking on that and then slideshow, view slides. Okay, so should come up any moment, I hope. Technologies being what they are, full of glitches. I guess we design them like that so we can then troubleshoot them and repair them. The idea of vertical farming arose in a classroom that I taught, a class I should say, at Columbia University called Medical Ecology. And the premise of the course was that the more we damage the natural systems that support us, the more health risks there are for us to look forward to. And this became a very depressing subject for those students because they had never heard all of this in one little place before. So as I worked my way through these presentations, they petitioned me to work on something more uplifting. And they picked rooftop gardening as their focus. And they wanted to see how many people they could feed in, let's limit it to Manhattan. That's pretty big though. It's about 2.8 million people, lots of rooftops, lots of interesting possibilities. And they worked all semester on it. And at the end, they ended up concluding they could feed, if they grew rice on the rooftops of the available buildings in Manhattan, they could feed about 2% of the population with about 1,000 calories per person per day. They were more depressed over that than they were over the subjects that I was covering. And that's when I turned to them, last day of class, no kidding, I'm not making this, you can't make this up. And I said to them, what if we turned your good idea, which is a good idea, into a better idea by simply increasing the volume that you can produce food in and by moving it indoors. So then instead of being only on the rooftop, it was on floor number 1, number 2, number 3, and depending on how high the building was, we could raise lots more food that way by a multiple of floors. And they thought that was a great idea and actually asked me if we could actually do that. And I said, of course we can. Not knowing, of course, that you could or couldn't, but I didn't have the heart to tell them that this is just an idea and not reality. That was in 1999, sorry. Today, it's 2021. And the idea has not only become a reality, it has become an industry. So I am enormously proud of my students for forcing me to work on this project for 10 years after the idea came up, so that it matured into something that I will now present to you. In order to grow plants indoors, or outdoors for that matter, they require things that we must supply to them. And so this is starting at a very basic level. What you see on the left of the screen are the list of elements that are absolutely required for every plant that's a higher plant, not algae, not lower plants like lichens and things like that, but plants that flower and give rise to crops like the basil that you see on the right. So it's got 18 of these that it absolutely requires in order to mature into a plant that's going to give rise to another plant. In addition to that, of course, they need sunlight, they need water, and above all, they need an organic source of nitrogen. The air is 75%, 76% nitrogen, but it's not organic nitrogen, it's N2. It's unavailable to most life forms, not to all life forms, but to most. There are some life forms that will convert N2 into other organic molecules, like ammonia, for instance, as we see here. If we manipulate ammonia chemically, we can create ammonium nitrate, which turns out to be one of the world's largest and most frequently used fertilizers to supply all plants living with organic nitrogen. That's a revelation because we didn't know that before there was a formal chemistry. So this took many millennia to learn and to embed it into our procedures for growing plants. Now, if we want to grow these plants indoors, we have to supply them with 18 of these elements: sunlight, water, and organic nitrogen. But if we want to eat them to keep ourselves alive, that's a different question. We need to add to that list the ones that you see here in orange. Sodium, for instance. Plants don't require sodium, but we do. Fluorine. We require fluorine to strengthen our bones and teeth. Chromium, of all things, magnesium, and lots of other heavy metals that we use in our proteins in order to make them work more efficiently. So we need a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 more elements than plants need. Now, if we were to grow all of our plants indoors and restrict them to only the elements that the plants need, you could not live on those plants. So we have to allow for a broader range of nutrition in order to supply food to mammals, us, that stems from a controlled environment agriculture, as I'll get to talk about. We learned how to grow plants indoors very early in the rise of the industrial complex. In the late 1700s, there were greenhouses, but they didn't have a very good window system because the isinglass was the only available source of clear material to use. It wasn't very efficient in allowing sunlight in. But in the 1800s, plate glass was invented. And once plate glass was invented, the greenhouse industry went crazy. And so did all of the the botanical gardens around the world, which were established for the sole reason of showing off all of their colonies and the plants that they could derive from them and grow them anywhere they wanted. So England was one of the first to have a conservatory of botanicals derived from all of their colonies throughout the world. Well, this idea about a greenhouse morphed rather slowly, I would say, to the present, where we are now stacking greenhouses on top of each other. And we're going to call those vertical farms. If you want a definition of a vertical farm, it's quite simple. It's more than a one-story greenhouse. But making it work is a very difficult situation with regards to how easy it is to get a greenhouse to work. Because once you start to cover up the plants with layers of floors, you start to require other resources in order to supply them with everything they need. Most important one, of course, is sunlight. But let's look first at what the plate glass industry and the desire to bring the outside inside resulted in. And this is the New York Botanical Garden. It's a beautiful place to go. These are orchids. Lots of other plants are also shown there. And they all grow beautifully because we can control their environment. This is the very first botanical conservatory. It's Kew Gardens in London. I've had the pleasure of visiting this facility, and it is most amazing. And whatever plant type you think you want to see, they're growing it inside this building. Desert plants, high alpine meadow plants, lowland swamp plants, you name it, and they can create the environment that's perfect for that kind of plant. And that's the advantage of these conservatories. They can virtually grow anything they want. This is the New York Botanical Gardens. And these are Victoria water lilies that only grow in South America, but you can see quite plainly they're also growing in New York City. And if you go inside, you'll see even more exotic plants than that. And that's why people keep coming back to these places, because they're interesting and they're educational. Here's one in Denver, and you can walk through this and feel as though you're not in Denver, obviously. Even in the coldest of wintry days, it gives you a respite from the seasons, and it transports you back to a place that you may have only dreamed about. But because they can grow anything they want, they've created a tropical environment for you. Now, if you're wondering what you can grow inside, this is the answer to that question. This is a plant found only in Borneo. It's called the Titan flower. And interestingly enough, this flower only blooms, or plant only blooms once every 17 years. And you can see all these people standing around gawking and wondering, why am I standing here? Because all I can smell is the odor of rotting meat. Well, it turns out this plant purposefully has evolved that as a strategy for attracting flies to it so that they will become covered with their pollen and move on to another plant and pollinate that other Titan flower, which might be 20 miles away. They're not a densely populated group of plants in Borneo by any means. But almost every botanical garden has one of them, and they use it as proof of concept that we can grow anything that grows outside inside. One of the most remarkable of the botanical gardens is in St. Louis. It's the Missouri Botanical Gardens, and it's not just a botanical gardens, it's a major research center also as to how to grow plants indoors. It has an international reputation as one of the most advanced, scientifically ahead of the schedule, so to speak, of all the other grow systems that are out there. If you want to know how to grow a plant indoors, visit the Missouri Botanical Gardens and visit some of their technical experts, and they'll be glad to show you. Inside, it's a wonderland of exotic plants, again, to awe and inspire people with regards to the biodiversity of life on this planet. I had the pleasure of visiting this facility in Singapore recently. It's called the Cloud Forest. It's 5 stories tall. It's totally enclosed. The outside temperature was 95 degrees and the humidity was about 80%. Inside, the temperature of this place was 70 degrees Fahrenheit and about 55 to 60%. So you can imagine where I would prefer to spend my time. And I spent almost all day in this facility. But the reason really why I was there was to see all the pitcher plants. The pitcher plants are native to Borneo as well as the Titan plant. And there are over 50 species of pitcher plants in the world, and almost 90% come from Borneo. But also they now come from Singapore because they're all throughout this 5-story water tower. A place that everybody might be more familiar with is the Epcot Center in Disney World in Orlando, Florida. And inside is a demonstration project, basically, as to which plants can we grow indoors. Again, the same theme, a little bit different take. Maybe there are a lot of indigenous Florida plants inside. There are certainly citrus plants because that's one of their main crops in outdoor agriculture in that state. But if you move down now into Arizona, which is a desert, which has very little in the way of biodiversity in terms of plant life, you can find this facility called Biosphere 2. Its purpose was to demonstrate indoors by recreating all of the 5 biomes of the major biomes on Earth and to watch them interact with each other, exchange nutrients, water, not necessarily plants, because the conditions were maintained to favor each of those 5 biomes separately. The experiment failed a little bit because of some, I won't go into the reasons why it failed, but it did fail. But right now it's being used by the University of Arizona as a training center for how to grow food indoors. And it's a wonderful application for this Biosphere 2 facility. It's a remarkable place, no matter what. I've also had the privilege of touring it. And it's amazing that humans can think enough ahead in terms of requirements of plants to actually duplicate what they need without knowing much about their biology, by the way, I must say. we know very little about plant biology because we don't fully understand the process of photosynthesis. I like this one in particular because it's in England. That's not why I like it. I like it because inside of these domes, made out of ethylene tetrafluoroethylene, which is a substitute for glass, it's as transparent but many, many times stronger, are exotic plants that are considered endangered species. And they're kept here for a good reason. They're waiting patiently for their outdoor habitats to restore themselves so they can transplant these plants back to where they came from. And that's why it's called the Eden Project. They want to recreate the way the earth was before humans came along and started to cull out portions of it for themselves at the expense, of course, of these plants. If you go inside, you can see a remarkable variety of tropical and subtropical plants for the most part. And it's a major tourist attraction. If you go to England and if you have the opportunity to go there, you won't be disappointed. But we love to surround ourselves by plants, even if it's not in an herbarium or a conservatory. Here is a plan for Heathrow Airport to build something they're calling the Sky Garden, where you can go up and relax and be surrounded by nature as you watch plane after plane take off. Hopefully the one you're watching at that moment is not the one you should have been on. But the seduction of this rendering is quite obvious. People want to be close to nature and they want to feel as though they're part of nature. And that's why we hike, that's why we swim, that's why we go fishing, that's why we do a number of things outdoors. We are drawn to it because I think instinctively we know that's where we came from. But there are fewer and fewer places to go to that make you feel that way in the world today, because a lot of what we have done to make room for us has eliminated the very things that we need to be close to express our appreciation. And this is Earth Day. I know it's a cliche. I was obviously privileged to be present at the first Earth Day, and I've actually given talks at various places since then on this particular time. And being at this point in our history and still seeing the need for improvement in terms of appreciation for nature is, it's not depressing, but it lets you know about the time scale that it might take to bring us back to a time when everyone on Earth does appreciate the natural world for all the things it does for us. If you're so happy, so lucky and happy to get a first-class ticket on an Emirates airline, take it, even though your carbon footprint will be enormous, because the food that they're going to serve you, at least the vegetable part, was raised in a vertical farm in Dubai, and they stock all their airlines with all the produce that they make. It's a 150,000 square foot facility. And it shows you how you can sort of, well, I wish I didn't have to fly, but if I do have to fly, I'd like to fly eating healthy food. There's another airport where you can go wait for your flights. If I were flying and I got to Singapore and I didn't have many other places to go, I would book a room at this airport, and this would be my hotel. It's got amazing scenery, amazing rooms, and all of it resonates with nature. This is just another version of that shot that you just saw. So now we take a little flight of fancy to say, okay, growing food indoors is possible. Here's what the plants need. We know how to do that. What do you imagine the future of growing plants indoors to look like? Now, if you ask this gentleman, Vincent Callebaut, an architect in France, Paris, and obviously a futurist, his idea of what the world will look like maybe 100 or 200 years from now with regards to integrating plants into the built environment so that you don't really know where the built environment stops and the nature starts. He has made a number of renderings, all of which are, by his own admission, impractical. But what they do is they stimulate your thoughts with regards to what's possible maybe not exactly what you're looking at, but something different than what exists already. And if that's what he accomplishes, then he's very happy about that. The one I like particularly well is the one that's situated in the middle of the East River in New York City. He calls it the dragonfly. And it's, if you were a farmer, you'd say, well, where am I going to raise my food? I don't see the spots for my crops. The building is more or less a design exercise, but nonetheless, it's very inspiring to see what the human mind can imagine with regards to integrating nature with the built environment. He's got a book for sale in case any of you want to go buy it. It's a little pricey, but I'm sure that the images in there are well worth it. So Sydney, Australia wants to build one of these also. Not also, but of course he wants to be futuristic and still live in the present. So what you're seeing here is a version of their indoor gardens, and they're in the process of building that as we speak. Now, all of this may have stemmed from a cult film called Silent Running. Bruce Dern starred in this movie, and he was the sole human on this orbiting life raft, as you will. Or the Earth has gone into a deep, deep, deep depression. Life on Earth has been almost eliminated. But before that happened, they banked a number of plants and animals and put them on this spaceship and put it in orbit with the hope that the Earth will one day return to normal and you can reintroduce these plants back onto the surface of the Earth. A little bit like WALL-E, but WALL-E probably got their idea from this. And so did Star Wars, because if you look at the lower left-hand corner, you see two little droids. These are the pro droids to R2-D2 and CP3O. An even more fanciful trip into outer space is by Gerald O'Neill. He had another book called Colonies in Space, and then he wrote a book on top of that, which gave more ideas to the concept. And this is a torus situated some 300 miles above the surface of the Earth. It's about 5 miles in diameter, and it's got living plants and animals, and it looks as though it's an Earth habitat transported into outer space. Of course, it would have never been built, but he imagined that maybe someday we'll have to do that. Well, before that happens, I guess these guys will have something to say about it, because they all want to move and go somewhere else. Particularly Elon Musk, he would love to live on Mars. We've gotten a couple of looks at Mars already, and I don't think it's a very good place to go to yet. You might be able to terraform it, but who knows? But in the meantime, I think we should make this planet as habitable as possible. And so I think if I were in charge of the resource allocations for these companies, I would redirect at least most of it to repairing the Earth before we got interested in taking the human condition somewhere else. So my talk is obviously about indoor farming and what it means for the future of the built environment, and perhaps what it means for Earth as well. So it begins with this gentleman who systematized and scientificized, if you will, the process of hydroponics, or growing plants in water that's enriched in nutrients. Hydroponic, I guess, is a Greek word. I've been told it means strong water. And this gentleman did most of his work in the 1930s at the University of California at Berkeley. And I own this book because you can buy it on Amazon. It's available. And it's a wonderful beginner's book on how to grow food without soil, either indoors or outdoors. You can do it either way. And his first crops were potatoes. He grew them outdoors in a water bin that he enriched with nutrients by just allowing grass to rot inside the water. And they release their nutrition and the nutrients, and the potatoes grew like wildfire. And he proved to everybody's satisfaction that hydroponic growing is practical. Today, we have a number of versions of hydroponic farming, as you see represented here. And by the way, I'm willing to share this PowerPoint with all the the participants of this wonderful meeting. So I will leave that on file for you, and please feel free to share it with anybody who requested through the meeting. The one I'm particularly fond of, though, is not a hydroponic system, which uses a lot less water than outdoor farming does, but the aeroponic system, which uses a lot less water than the indoor hydroponic system does. So if you want to know the ratio of this, hydroponic farming in general uses about 70% less water than outdoor farming. But I didn't actually say what outdoor farming uses. Outdoor farming uses about 70% of the liquid fresh water on our planet. I'll pause here because that's a lot of water. And they spoil it by fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides, which then pollute the runoff and make it unusable for any other purpose, like drinking, for instance. Aeroponics does not do that, nor does hydroponics. There is no runoff from an indoor farm. But aeroponics uses 70% less water than hydroponics. It uses 95% less water than outdoor farms, and that's why I'm particularly fond of it, because you get the same result with a minuscule amount of water. The advantage of aeroponics goes beyond just the water usage. The root systems are hanging in air. And as you'll notice in this diagram, the roots are not colored green. Everybody knows the roots of a plant are not green. They're either whitish or brownish or some other color, but they do not possess chlorophyll. So therefore, they do not photosynthesize. Why should they? They're underground. So in order to supply them with oxygen, which they need, just like you and I, if you're interested in hydroponic farming, you have to aerate the water. If you don't, the roots will die. If the roots die, of course, then the plant dies. With aeroponics, you don't have that worry because they're already in air. They can absorb the air through their roots because they're wet, and there's an interface between the atmosphere and the wet root material. And it's one big worry of raising plants indoors that you don't have to worry about. So aeroponics is the growing system right now that everybody's favoring. And here's a fancier diagram. You can look at this if you want. I won't waste much time describing it, but it says basically the same thing as I just told you. Now, in 1999, when the idea first arose in my classroom, although I must say that this is an idea that occurred to other people too, Buckminster Fuller, Frank Lloyd Wright, lots of futurists were thinking about what it would be like to live in a city in which the food was grown in the city. And then the idea sort of faded out, and I was totally unaware of this until people brought that up to my attention, long after the idea of vertical farms was released. So in 1999, there were no vertical farms whatsoever. I wrote a book on the subject. It was called, of all things, The Vertical Farm. And the book, in it, the original version, had no pictures of vertical farms because there were none. Even as late as 2010, there were no vertical farms. But when the softcover book came out 2 years later, there were 3 vertical farms. 3. And this is a partial list of the vertical farms that now exist throughout the world as of 2021. And as you can see, there have been quite a lot of indoor growing activity surrounding this new technology that's becoming more and more efficient and cheaper and easier to use every moment that we speak. Vertical farms can now be found in most Northern Hemisphere countries, not all of them, of course, but soon, yes, they all will have some version of a vertical farm. It's very slower treading when you look at the below the equator portion of the world. A lot of those countries are either not able to afford it, or they're busy with other major health problems that prohibit them from using some of their valuable resources for just growing food when half of the population is susceptible to malaria, for instance. So we're fortunate that we live in an area of the world where deep pockets exist that can fund some of these projects that will result either in the profitability of growing food indoors or they'll fail. A lot of deep pocket people don't care if they fail or succeed as long as they're spending their money for a worthy cause. But what you see here is a growth industry it's perched on the next big step, which is to make this available to whoever wants it. The United States looks more or less like it's getting over a case of chickenpox. I would prefer to see it at the height of the chickenpox epidemic, where all the states have big red dots all over them, but that hasn't happened yet. But it could happen. I'm not saying it will, but I'm saying it has the potential for becoming much more robust than you see here. There are lots of websites now out about vertical farming and the advantages and disadvantages, and I think these are worth going to. This is a friend of mine, Gene Giacomelli. He's at the University of Arizona, and he manages the Biosphere 2 facility for training people on how to grow food indoors. Well, NASA, he's worked with NASA quite a bit in the past, and here's one of the things they commissioned. They wanted a lunar growing chamber so that when there's finally a colony on the moon, we'll be able to supply our astronauts and moon naughts, moon men and women, with fresh vegetables. He already manages a vertical, well, not vertical farm, but it's above the surface of Antarctica, but it's only a one-layer farm. He manages this facility from his office in Arizona, and he feeds the plants, and he looks at their health, and he relays the information to people living there and tells them what to do. It's quite interesting how he's using artificial intelligence to do that. If you go to the internet and just type out the words vertical and then farm, and then hit Google Images, you get this. There are page after page after page of real and not so real vertical farms for you to look at and to, revel at. Look at all the varieties of the way people envision this technology. They're not all the same. They don't all grow the same things, although leafy greens are very popular. There are other crops that are also being grown. But the fact is that 7 years ago, you couldn't have done this. Speaks volumes to the fact that this must have been a good idea to a lot of other people besides myself, because once they heard about it, and they sat down and thought it over, they found a way to do it. So those are the courageous people that took economic and reputational risks in going into an industry that actually didn't exist. But today it does exist. So it raises the question, the main question, of course, is what can I grow? Which plants can be grown indoors? Well, if you go back to the Titan plant, you've got your answer already, but what edible plants? I wouldn't eat a Titan plant on a bet. It would taste as badly as it smelled, I'm sure. But there are now websites that actually want to advise the amateur home grower, if you've got a home growing system that takes advantage of either aeroponics or hydroponics, and there are many on the market. These are the varieties of plants that you can grow without any trouble whatsoever. You just buy the seeds, germinate them, stick them into the device, click the on switch, and wait your turn so that you can start picking your own dinners. I'll just show you some pictures of produce that's routinely grown indoors. These are routinely grown indoors. Tomatoes, and that's a greenhouse, of course, but multiple layers, of course, you've got a multiple layer greenhouse for growing tomatoes. Root vegetables, radishes, easy to do. Potatoes, the original crop that Dr. Garak did back at University of California at Berkeley. We can grow those easily, all varieties that we know of, and there are over 400 varieties of potatoes. They all come from Peru. They can all be grown hydroponically. And they can be grown aeroponically as well. Easy to harvest, very easy to harvest. No soil. In fact, if the solutions to grow the plants are kept clean, there's no need to wash them before selling them either. Because you can save a lot of water in lots of different ways. Not true for this particular picture's worth, but nonetheless, notice that the edible part of the turnip, besides the turnip greens, the turnip plant itself, is growing above the ground. So the turnip bulb is not the root of the plant. The root of the plant is actually a little tiny white thread that goes down into the soil. So if you're clever and you use a growth medium that doesn't leave residue like this one, what you can do is just simply tug on the turnip and with a pair of scissors, cut off the root, and the turnip is all set to be sold if they want the turnip greens out to be fine too. Carrots obviously can be grown hydroponically and aeroponically. I'm very fond of carrots, as you can see here, and so is my good friend Bugs. And there are lots of varieties of carrots. I never knew there were round ones, but apparently there are. It's a popular crop. You can raise lots of bush berries as well. Here are some blackberries, and here's some blueberries. Blueberries will require pollinators. So you have to think about that when you're raising crops indoors. Who will pollinate the flowers to make the fruit? And the answer in this case is bumblebees. The bumblebees are easily colonized, and they are homebodies. They don't want to leave the hive or the flowers. So if you rotate your crops indoors, you can keep bumblebees happy 24/7, 365 days of the year. So plants that you might not consider to be greenhouse plants, like zucchini or squash or even watermelons. Of course, you have to make sure that when they get big, they don't endanger anybody's life that's walking underneath them. Lots of other kinds of melons too, cantaloupes. They're very, very easy to raise once you know what the conditions are that are required for these plants. And look at how beautiful these eggplants look. They look perfect, and in fact, they are. There's no insect pests. There's no delay or over watering, like for instance, outdoors when it rains too much, or when the sun doesn't shine, or when the sun shines too much and there's no rain. Those all upset the way plants grow outdoors. Indoors, all those conditions can totally be controlled by you. And that's the biggest advantage, is that outdoors farmers control nothing. Even though they put pesticides and herbicides on their crops, they still can't keep out a lot of the pests and a lot of the weeds. Indoors, the farmer controls virtually every aspect of life of this plant. And if it doesn't come out right, it's not the plant's fault, it's the farmer's fault. Now, outdoors, plants that are edible, usually you get about a 70% yield from the seeds that you plant. They may all germinate and they may all come up out of the ground, but not a lot of them survive to the end for harvesting. 70% is about as much as you can expect. In other places, like say, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa, it's much, much less. It's around 30%. You can grow crops that you ordinarily wouldn't think of as an indoor crop, like for instance, rice. Now, rice is hydroponically grown and aeroponically grown too, because the root systems need to be in water almost constantly until they get to the stage where the rice grains are being produced. And then they have to dry out. So they go through a water phase and a dry phase before the rice actually matures. And that's done by the weather outdoors. But indoors, you can, like I said, you can control it. So the crops that you get indoors are produced more often, and the yield is higher. So for two good reasons, indoor farming beats outdoor farming. We have a lot of plans that are submitted online by people who are designers or engineers or both, showing us their version of the way a vertical farm should be. And you can find many, many, many of these images now. In the beginning of this idea, there were none. And now there can never be too many, but there are certainly a lot more now than I had any right to expect when this idea first emerged. Many of them are very good ideas. Many of them have been applied to vertical farms that now exist. And I'm not giving you any details here because these are all hypothetical constructs. Notice the one here, they had four-legged and two-legged animals included into their vertical farm as well. That's not typical. This is somebody's PhD student thesis that they were doing for postgraduate course in architecture. But this is real. I'm going to tell you now, this is a planted system that is run by a company called Plenty. They're a San Francisco-based company, and they are truly vertical. These walls go up 3 or 4 stories tall. The grow lights are stationary and the walls move. The plants actually rotate around these plants, around the lights rather. Harvesting is very, very simple. It's continuous. Planting is continuous. So this works 24/7. Here's one closer to where I live. I live in New Jersey, and this AeroFarms is found in Newark, and it's a vertical farm that took over an old ironworks in the center, in the heart of Newark, in the Ironbound district. And they've transformed it into a quite beautiful space. It's 5 stories tall, and it grows food all the way up to the ceiling. This exists not too far away from Disney World. It's run by a company called Calera, and you can see the rack after rack after rack of produce being grown indoors. And a lot of this ends up in grocery stores, schools, hospitals, and even prisons. This vertical farm company, Vertical Harvest, I'm very familiar with because I know the owner pretty well, Nono Yohe, and her former partner, Penny McBride. Penny has moved on to another industry, but Nona is still there. And in fact, she's now busy working on a new project in Pennsylvania, in Lancaster, to establish a commercial vertical farm. This is a demonstration project, but one of her big social issues is what do we do with all these people that are considered unemployable? And by those people, we mean the people with autism, the people that have Down syndrome, other handicapped people that want to do work and are able to do work, but there are no industries there to hire them. And so she did. She hired them. And they're now all working inside, and it's an absolute perfect match. There are simple jobs, less simple jobs, complex jobs, depending on your level of skills. You can graduate through each one if you're good enough. But it doesn't require being good. It just requires being industrious. And she's been very, very successful. And the state of Wyoming is very grateful because she decreased the unemployment rate in those groups by 95% simply by hiring enough people to work in this vertical farm, which is located in downtown Jackson. The growing system that I'm fond of, aeroponics, has been elevated to a new level of engineering competence by this company called Essence Grows. These are rack after rack after rack of aeroponically grown plants. I had the pleasure of visiting this about 4 years ago now. And the surprise to everyone was that when we walked into the facility where they were manufacturing these grow systems, there were virtually every kind of plant that you could think of that you could eat represented by the aeroponic growth of those plants. So these systems are adaptable by separating the racks further apart to accommodate taller plants. More densely grown plants like leafy greens are good for this. But again, root vegetables, vine vegetables, there's nothing that can't be grown using aeroponics. Speaking of aeroponics, the inventor of the tower gardens is Tim Blank. I met him several times. We've talked together at meetings. And he used to be the director of plant growth technologies for Epcot Center. And he got his ideas for this growth system by simply working on how to grow these plants indoors. His grow system is quite simple. It's a tower. There are holes cut out along the tower. It's a PVC piece of plastic. It's been treated so it doesn't elute contaminants to the plants. And then there's this tub at the bottom, which contains the water and the nutrient solution with a pump. And the pump creates a spray that goes up to the top of each of these towers and then sort of trickles down across the root systems of the plants that are growing inside the tube. Plants that are grown this way grow twice as fast as ordinary aeroponic systems. And so I think his system deserves a great deal of attention. And a lot of people have used it. Here's a commercial version of his tower gardens. And you can see how productive they are. Here's a chef in New York City, John Mooney. He runs Bell Book and Candle restaurant in the Chelsea district of New York City. This is his rooftop, and you can see tower garden on the rooftop. And every day during the growing season, he can go up there and harvest as fresh set of produce as you can possibly imagine for the cuisines that his restaurant features. One of the best examples of how to apply this to the built environment, that is vertical farming, occurred here in Utrecht, where some very clever people got together and said, look, we want to run a restaurant and we want the restaurant to serve the finest quality produce we can get. So why don't we grow it ourselves? So they stuck the vertical farm on top of the restaurant and they called it the greenhouse. This is a remarkable advance of the concept. And you can imagine this happening in many, many places throughout the world. And this restaurant is always full, of course, except for this pandemic, but it's filling back up because the pandemic is easing up. Now, if you're considering what are we going to do about other sources of nutrition, many people in the world still adhere to a meat-filled meal and a dairy-filled meal like cheese, cream, those sorts of things. We have a solution for you, and that is you can grow the food for your cattle in a vertical farm. And what you see here is one such farm where 500 square feet can feed 50 cows a day. And if you do the math, most dairy farms are not more than 200 cows. So you need 1,000 square feet, no, more than that. You need about 2,000 square feet of farm to feed 200 cows. Today, that would replace a lot of outdoor land that's also used to grow the food. And you can grow this year in and year out every day. And it's the same healthy crop every day. And that would obviously improve the nutritional value of the meat that you can make from this. And these systems are now online. You can buy them. You can install them. So we're really probably near the end of my presentation, although I know I was given an hour. I thought an hour was an awful long time for me to still talk. I would much rather someone else talk for the remaining 15 minutes that I've got. But I can tell you that the joy that I've had in writing this book was matched only by the fact that the publisher agreed to publish a 10th edition, anniversary edition. And in it, I list all of the current vertical farms that exist. So if you have the old book, well, too bad you need the new one. Not too bad. So I've been truly gifted by being at a place where the students were willing to buy into this concept. They worked very hard on it. They put their full effort into it. And because of them, because 10 years worth of that teaching experience resulted in this project, and this project had no purpose whatsoever except to express a point of view as to how we view the world. I guess I should have prefaced all of this by saying that agriculture is probably the worst way in which you could choose to grow your food if what you wanted to do really is live within the bounds of nature. Because in order to farm, you've got to make room for it. And making room for farming means that you're removing something else. And in many instances, it's hardwood forest or a prairie for wheat and barley. So you're despoiling the environment inadvertently or vertently. It doesn't matter whether you're doing it on purpose or not. The fact is that farmers produce food, and everybody knows that everybody needs food. So no one blames the farmer for doing that. But today we have alternatives. And you can imagine now how many vertical farms there are. And just try to imagine that each vertical farm on average per floor generates about 10 to 100 times more produce than outdoor farms of an equivalent footprint. So if you were to take this farm and then project outwards and say, how much land have we saved by vertical farming? The answer today would be minuscule, because outdoor farming still farms the size of South America in footprint. That's an enormous landmass. So 7.8 billion people need the size of South America to supply them with food. The question is, can we convert to a system in which we're not harming the earth, but we still get the food? And by farming indoors in cities and in the suburbs and even in the rural areas also, we have the option of converting a lot of our farming to this method. And then when we do that, since this is a pitch for Earth Day, we give back land to nature that we stole from them in order to make room for our farms.
Amen.
And nature has a way of repairing itself. If you just leave it alone, eventually it will find out what it used to do. The seeds will magically appear, although they've already been in there in the soil. They were just prevented from germinating because the farmer was using herbicides. So that's basically all I have to say. I really want to thank the organizers again for inviting me to give this talk, and think of me next Earth Day, and I'll be glad to come back.
Well, Dickson, thank you very much for all that wonderful information. It did my heart good to see a lot of that stuff. For anybody that's on my Christmas list, you now know what you're getting.
There's a lot of used copies out there, Joseph.
Yeah, I would definitely like to get that newer copy with the picture book and get that into people's book clubs, because that's, again, like you were talking about, the visuals are really inspirational. And again, that's the power of this summit. You know, there's a lot of things going on today. It's a beautiful day outside, and I do not begrudge anybody who chose to be outside instead of sitting in front of a computer. But it's grateful that we're broadcasting live. We're going to be recording this. People will be able to see this information. They will be able to dream and think. And you know what I really like. So the other thing I want to make sure to tell you is that, you know, even if I have to do it on a rick cart, I will get you up here for some fishing sometime soon. So the idea, part of the idea of this summit was actually to create milestones on where we wanted to go. And one of the reasons that I asked you specifically to present in the manner that you did on the things that you were doing is because, you know, this is exactly, this speaks to more than what we're capable of doing with food. I mean, this really just speaks to what we're capable with human potential. And it makes me kind of sad on what the opportunities we've missed by not trying, you know, by not wanting to fail. You know, like there were some things with this summit that didn't happen the way we wanted it to happen. And there may have been other people that might have canceled it and said, you know, this isn't going to be the way we want it to. But, you know, this has been awesome. And it's getting good information out there, and it's showing people solutions. And right now, that's what we really need to hear, because a lot of these other Earth Day events, they're talking about doing good stuff.
True.
But they're talking about planting trees and shopping bags. And while important, these are not going to keep pace with the rate of change that we see in the world.
Yeah,
and the rate of innovation that we're seeing, like you were talking about with, you know, when in 2010 there was 3, and now there are, you know, hundreds. And now there are people actually out there like Michael that are working on projects to actually integrate food systems into city designs. So that's what we're working on with the 2150 project, is actually designing cities around the idea of feeding its populace. And that was one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, but I wanted to follow up a little bit here first, because when I first got your book 10 years ago, the first thing I did is I built my first vertical farm. I went and got 7 20-gallon aquariums and put seed starters in all of them and stacked them up and took a picture. So I was doing vertical farming before it was cool in Alaska. And you know, it's both ironic and challenging, because in Alaska, we import 95% of our food, and it comes up here on barges, 4 of them. So on our best days, our fresh fruit is nearly a week old, and that's
Right.
not even to mention what happens trying to get it out to the villages where it could be a month old. And so this is obviously very unstable right now. We
Yep.
have a system where 1 in 6 Alaskans are insecure. Now, one of the challenges, one of the benefits of all this stuff is that, you know, when I started doing this, the reason that I was reaching out and doing this research and met you and Dan and the others that are involved in this stuff, was because we have a 10-story building, an old hotel in downtown Fairbanks. And we built a business plan around how we could turn that into a vertical farm. Now, the building, unfortunately, is no longer salvageable, but this is, especially if you look at mixed use development, just like you don't grow just one crop, you
That's
don't
right.
use just a building for one thing. You
Very
mentioned
true.
vertical harvest, and I reached out to those folks, and unfortunately our scheduling wasn't able to match to show them as a case study. But the idea of being able to not only put these different types of people to work, but being able to house them. You could have, I think one of the models that I've seen that I really liked was in the Midwest, where it was a 5-story building, and the third story was where the main growing was. The second story was where they processed the stuff they grew upstairs. And the fourth story was where they had people living, and then they had the then they had chicken coops on the rooftop. And then at the bottom level, they had a grocery store and a restaurant. That's the kind of vertical integration that we need to be seeing.
No
And
question. No question.
yeah, and the idea here, the challenge, one of the questions you brought up was that vertical farming is better than traditional farming. And I know a lot of my farming friends are cringing right now. And what I've been trying to encourage them to think about is that vertical farming can be their winter crop, especially here in Alaska, as a way to supplement their existing income, as also a way to integrate with the community and make better connections with the restaurants. Because as great as farmer markets are, driving economic change is limited in that capacity because people's food habits change so much. But with restaurants and grocery stores and stuff like that, you have a lot more stable demand, and that's basically a lot easier to build a supply around. And
Very true.
and the other thing is that a lot of the stuff, especially up here, revolves around energy. The one of the
Yep.
challenges why it's not being done up here is because we recognize that in order to make it cost effective, we basically have to make the building net zero, and basically make all the energy on site. And doing that makes the utility look bad when they're trying to sell us more coal plants. So there's politics involved in all this stuff, but at the same time, we need these kind of things, and we need the economies they bring. And that was one of the questions I had for you, is that while there's been a surge of all of these, this growth of a movement into an industry, I've also noticed that it's become an industry where people are protecting their business plans and their models and stuff like that. Have you seen that adversarial culture develop?
Well, not so much adversarial, but definitely priorities. Aerofarms, for instance, has a patented process that they grow their crops with. And of course, they're not going to share that. They'll license it, but they won't share it. And but I know a lot of others, though, that are absolutely willing to invite you in and show you how to do it and teach you how to do it. There's an organization out on Long Island called Square Roots. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're a training center for growing food in repurposed shipping containers. And they're outfitted with grow lights and hydroponic systems. And guess who's running it? The brother of Elon Musk, Kimball Musk. So when you've got people at that level, and it's an open source menu. You get the booklet on how to do it. You can share it with your friends. They're not hiding anything. It's not a secret as to how to grow food indoors. Ask any botanical garden; they'll just gladly tell you all about it. But there's no industry association yet. There should be, but there isn't. And when that it comes, and it's going to come soon, because the USDA is going to start regulating the indoor growing food industry. And that's going to have to form a society of farmers that push back against some of the more draconian regulations and don't recognize indoor growing as organic. And in fact, that first slide that I showed of all the needs of the plants, it's not organic at all. It's inorganic. It's even better than organic. Organic means you've got a lot of other things coming in besides what you want, even though you don't want them. You try not to, but they're there. With inorganic farming, except for that nitrogen source, you can keep everything else out, heavy metals, pesticides, herbicides, etc. So I don't see people withholding information as much as I do fear of failing. The biggest thing I've heard from almost all the owners of these places is that they hope they don't exceed the market value. And I can tell you now that the only farms that have failed so far are the ones that did not expect to succeed, but did. And when they succeeded, they could not meet the demand of the customer base. And they lost them because they said, well, you can't supply it for us. What good is having it grown indoors? I'll just get it from a supplier and they can get it from wherever they want. And that was too bad because they really didn't perceive the true value of their vertical farms. And one of them was called Farmed Here. It was near Chicago. And I knew those people, and they were very nice people, and they were very well-meaning, but they had no idea of how popular their farm would be when they opened it. And that's the biggest. The difficulty is finding people that know how to run them, how to grow plants, where are they trained. There are very few places throughout the world that have training centers for indoor growing. We need more of that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of cannabis farmers up here that in many places.
I agree.
how to grow it indoors.
You can't
and
eat,
stuff.
you might as well smoke it, I guess. But
But see, I feel like that's a lot of opportunity, a lot of missed opportunity, especially dealing with the the folks that are in reentry programs, and
Yep.
especially people getting out of high school that are looking for new careers. And
that's right, exactly right.
And right now, what I love is there's so many online resources for this stuff, and there's so many places, and it's not just watching some YouTube videos, going out and trying it. You can actually go. I think Cornell University was offering online degree programs in sustainability and and kind of stuff like this. So people there's a lot of people that have taken this opportunity the last year to rebrand themselves or to become a better version of themselves. And that's kind of what we're here to do today, because we know that in order to solve this climate crisis, we recognize that it's a crisis of conscience, and we basically have to learn how to become a better version of ourselves, which means we have to start investing in our cities and making them a better version of themselves too. And that's what we're trying to do, and that's where food becomes such a critical part of this, because first of all, everybody likes to eat. I have not met a single person yet who does not like to eat. So
there are people with anorexia.
Well, those people unfortunately have health issues that need help, but no healthy person or normal person. Yeah. So the idea though is that growing food locally, hyper locally. One of the where Graham and I met was working together on a competition to incorporate food into buildings, into houses, and using that as a catalyst to be able to make luxury housing affordable for everyone. Yeah. And houses and buildings and communities. And basically we were postulating the idea that it doesn't make any sense to grow our cities one building at a time. So that's one of the reasons I'm in Alaska, is because we have the opportunity here, to go out and buy 160 acres, invest $50 billion and build a city. And going back to what you're talking about with Buckminster Fuller, it's not just the cities that grow food, it's the dome cities that are able to withstand the massive climate changes that are going to be coming, that we're not going to be able to ignore. We found out early in this pandemic what will happen once we've been able to find our balance with the planet. But I really like the comment that you made about the fact that as we're able to move more of our food production indoors, we can actually restore some of the natural lands. Because there's this really strange idea that we're the only ones that deserve to have land. that the other creatures of this world, they can just be pushed aside, and that's coming back to bite us in more ways than one.
I thought
Um,
that the result in Yellowstone Park recently was a good example of that. They had a mauling in Yellowstone Park right in the middle of the campgrounds, and the ranger who was mauled unfortunately died. So, you live next to nature and you take your chances. But if you live in the city and you stay within your limits, then nature will come back on its own. We don't have to do anything. We just watch it happen. And the process is called rewilding. I'm sure you know that, but maybe some of the participants don't, the listeners, I should say, the registrants. Spain, France, Germany, Italy, England, all of those European countries realize the value of wild land, and they're creating lots of rewilded places that never had a possibility of being so maybe 30 years ago. So the health issues are really incredibly important. We need to slow down a lot of things, and nature has a way of doing that, but we don't give it a chance.
Yeah, well, we're finding out. I think 2020 served its purpose. It really did shine clarity on a lot of things. It
Yep.
brought a lot of things to the surface, and we're now in the process of redefining ourselves. And I think that's a really good thing. It gives us a better chance to upload new programming, or however you want to call it. But recognizing that the challenges that we face are not American challenges. They're not European challenges. They're not African challenges.
Humanity
They're human
challenges. Right.
Yeah, and the only way we're going to solve them is to first and foremost make sure that we look at it from that perspective and stop this national division. Well, I'm going to take care of mine. Good luck with yours.
Right.
So that's the shift that needs to occur. And again, this is where we go back to why I think food is such a critical component to the transition. Is when people grow things, they have this uncanny habit of starting to nurture other things and to start caring about the people around them. So when you're eating processed food and you're watching processed TV, and your whole existence is focused on reinforcing what you think you already believe, you disconnect and you become artificial. And I think that's why we're all the disease that we all have, that consumption has left us with. And then we have a society that makes us feel bad about ourselves and disconnects us from nature. And so we've got this hole. And that's what we have the shopping network for. So when people are able to start growing again, and we've been actually introducing the concept of guerrilla gardening, and and sharing this idea of vertical farming and extending it to bottle gardening in windows, and to basically growing what food you can with what you have where you're at.
Yep.
And that, I think, is a critical part to being able to explore the different ways of the food industry. Like we were talking with Graham before, is that it's not just about food, it's about the whole food industry. So that's one of the questions I wanted to ask you. So the summary of this event today is going to be giving folks an opportunity to actually work on developing their food plans. Not the food plans in their cupboards, but the plans for their communities. And what we've done here in Alaska, which has really stimulated the conversation, and we're proposing, is that every group or every state look at, in 10 years, what's it going to take to grow 80% of your food for the population in that state. What do you think of that goal?
It's very ambitious, but it's very doable also.
Well, you understand the idea that the goal isn't just to, obviously we're going to have to think about all of the factors of food growing, the traditional farming, advanced farming, even foraging. All of that plays into the elements that go into a sustainable food system, or as we are calling it, food sovereignty.
Right.
A food security is regular access to Walmart. Food sovereignty is controlling the means of production. And it has a huge impact on people's health, especially in the villages where we're losing culture because we don't have any jobs. We're impacting our health because we're eating processed food. These things are very detrimental, and the opportunity to be hugely transformative. So that's part of what we're trying to do here, is to drive investment dollars and interest into Alaska as a proof of concept of other places like Idaho and Georgia and other places can start adapting more of these models. And then we can put on more of these events that showcase all of that stuff. What we need, Dickson, is Vertical Farm the movie. So,
well, I've had several false starts on that one, but we're working on it.
all right. So, Joseph, you got questions?
Yeah. So one of the things you brought up earlier was the issue of the overconsumption. The stores came in and they had the opportunity and they said, hey, you know what? And then all of a sudden it exploded. So when it comes to trying to determine what sort of scale you need to operate at as far as creating a vertical garden system, vertical farm system, do you have a good idea of how large you need to go in order to feed a specific amount of population? Because as Robert points out, it's one thing to go in and build a city from scratch. It's another thing to go in and try and retrofit these communities. New York does not have an awful lot of garden space, but they have lots of vertical walls, lots of vertical buildings for things to be converted, retrofitted into vertical gardens, multi-use, multi-purpose. Is there a way to start microgridding these so that you can eliminate these food deserts in the big cities?
Well, the answer is yes, of course, but it depends on who's in charge of this project. So if you're sitting at your computer, why don't you type out the word PRECHT?
Okay.
By that I mean, this is the name of an architect and his wife, and they have a solution that you would be absolutely in favor of. They want to create an apartment complex made out of cross-laminated timber in which every apartment grows its own food. So if you type it out and go to Google Images, you can get their complete story. There are also in-house, like for instance, my apartment, I could buy a unit today that could supply 30 to 40% of my leafy greens and maybe broccoli and maybe some other crops that I elect to put in there. And if every apartment had one of these and they had surpluses and they brought them downstairs to be redistributed back into the apartments for those that didn't have that, they wanted one of these, or like an exchange, a vegetable exchange group, that's also possible. That exists right now. The group out in Long Island, the Square Roots people, they're selling those containers to people with single family dwellings and putting them in their backyard. Instead of having a tool shed, you can have a vertical farm. Well, it's not quite a vertical farm, but if you stacked two of them on top of each other, they would be. So there's no answer to your question. That's the point. So it's funny you should mention designing a new city, because that's my project that I'm currently engaged with students at Fordham University on. So we've got a website called Fordhamopolis. That's FORDHAMOPOLIS. And you can see where the minds of undergraduates that live in a big city would like the built environment to go over the next 50 years. And it's got buildings that harvest rainwater, generate electricity through clear photovoltaics, grow food indoors using vertical farming technologies, and they're all made out of wood. So they sequester carbon. And when you make a building out of wood, you better be sure that it's not going to burn down. And cross-laminated timber is so thick, it's like stacking butcher blocks on top of each other and nailing the whole thing or gluing the whole thing together. You'll make it almost as thick as a tree trunk. And you'll notice after a forest fire, the trees don't burn down. The bark burns off, the tree dies, but the cellulose part of that tree is still intact. And that same thing happens with a house made out of cross-laminated timber. So imagine an entire city made out of cross-laminated timber, how much carbon out of the air that would sequester. And then think about all the trees that it took to make that city, and imagine them growing back, because it's a renewable resource, And in 20 years after that city is finished, you've got twice as much carbon sequestered as you had before. And if you just continue that thought process and work your way around the world and ask how often do buildings turn over in major cities, you'd be surprised at the answer. In New York City, for instance, there are less than 20% of the buildings that are dating back before 1900. 20%. There are 1 million structures in New York City, and only 20% of them date back to 1900. All the rest are between then and now. So the turnover rate of a city in terms of its buildings is very important to pay attention to, because that's an opportunity to change the building paradigm from concrete, steel, and iron to this new building material, which is called engineered wood. And there's a lot of activity on that in British Columbia, Washington State, Oregon, the timber states, basically. And I think Alaska could benefit greatly from that.
Yeah. There's a couple of things on note on there. I heard that some people are working on doing mycelium, building out of mycelium,
That's right.
growing houses. So those are options. Obviously, hemp's an option. It's a really fast growing material. Bamboo, all of those kind of things
Bamboo is a great material.
Yeah, those are all really good options. All of those are available for Alaska. But I think we could actually top one better, because one of the things Michael and I were talking about, and another friend of ours, Stevens, is that the idea of a living wall. Willow grows really fast, and if you stack them up and replant them, they'll grow straight. So we know that people actually have the patience, and in some places use willow to grow furniture. So we're looking for a group who's up to the challenge of designing a willow city. That the whole thing
that would be great.
The whole thing could be designed.
Keep the beavers away from it.
What's that?
You better keep the beavers away from it.
Yeah, well, definitely have to think about that. But the idea is that it is possible, and I think that there would be a market for people, because we know, as we talk about sustainable cities and advancing technology and stuff like that, not everybody wants to live in a big city, and even a futuristic one that quote unquote provides for all your needs. Some people just like the simple life. And that's where the whole idea of it's why when we set the goal of 80%, why we didn't go 100%, was because we recognized the need and the value of trade, not only for commerce but also for culture. So being able to keep that flow going is part of the diversity that keeps us strong. It's just like, it may seem like a good idea in the short term to plant all your garden with one crop, but we know how dangerous that is. And
True.
Planning our cities and this ultimately goes to terraforming planets. And this goes to what you were talking about with Elon and all those and those other folks, is because that's the value I see to what they're doing as related to what we need to do here. Is because as we learn more about other planets, we realize how precious this one is here. And there's and today we're celebrating Earth Day. We're celebrating Earth Day largely because of a trip we took to outer space, from which point we were able to actually see the Earth not as a bunch of countries that were fighting over resources, but as one home that this one family shares. And so aerospace has always been something that inspires us to be our best. That's why I like Star Trek. We may not get there, but if we strive to get there, where we land is going to be a whole lot better than where we would be if we didn't try. Just like with this summit, just like with your students, just like with any innovation, which I believe is the real resource that we need to be nurturing in this world.
Sure.
So I appreciate your time this afternoon. We have a